Okay, let's turn over the sheet and we'll talk for a few moments here. What does the disappearance of moral knowledge mean for our lives? It means the loss of moral guidance concerning good and evil, praiseworthy, blameworthy actions and characters, honorable and dishonorable lives and institutions, both for the individual trying to find his or her way, and for groups trying to live together in the way that is best. Without moral knowledge, individual and group life is left to drift at the behest of desire, force, and chance. I want you to contrast that now. Here's some words from David Hume. This is the latter part of the 18th century. He remarked that the end of all moral speculation is to teach us our duty, and by proper representation of the deformity of vice and the beauty of virtue, beget corresponding habits and engage us to avoid the one and embrace the other. What is honorable, what is fair, what is becoming, what is noble, what is generous, takes possession of the heart and animates us to embrace it and maintain it. That's pretty good, isn't it? And that's exactly how moral understanding and knowledge had been regarded. At the end of the 19th century, Henry Sidgwick, one of the greatest of the British philosophers at the time, said, "The moralist has a practical aim. We desire knowledge of right conduct in order to act on it." Now, you might say, well, for goodness sakes, why does he have to bother to state that? That's pretty obvious, isn't it? Here's a longer statement from Matthew Arnold. Some of you will know him. He was an older contemporary of Sidgwick and perhaps one of the most exemplary of enlightened people of his day. And he expressed the view that has predominated among ethical theorists for most of Western history. I quote, "The object of systems of morality is to take possession of human life, to save it from being abandoned to passion or allowed to drift at hazard, to give it happiness by establishing it in the practice of virtue. And this object those systems seek to do by presenting to human life fixed principles of action and fixed rules of conduct, in its inspired as well as in its uninspired moments, in its days of languor or gloom as well as in its days of sunshine and energy. Human life has thus always a clue to follow and may always be making its way toward its goal." You know, that's what you lose when you lose moral knowledge. Public discourse ceases to support morality. Proverbial wisdom becomes corny. That's corny, by the way, is worse than false. I like to compare it to electricity and knowledge of electricity. We once had no knowledge of electricity. Didn't even know what hit us when lightning struck. Now reflect about, we have a lot of knowledge of electricity now. And it's amazing what we can do with it. How we can cooperate with one another. How we can know whether or not someone else knows electricity and how to wire a house or use it in various kinds of instruments. What would happen now if knowledge of electricity disappeared? Knowledge. What would happen? Well, perhaps things would work for a while. Sort of. Then the certain loss of huge amounts of what is good would come. Think of doing medicine without electrical knowledge and power, of household chores, or travel, or communication. It doesn't just depend on electricity. The electricity is still there. What has gone is knowledge. Now, can you transfer that to the moral life? It has been said for several decades, a century or more, that we have been living off of the moral capital of past ages. It won't last forever. And there are deep issues about our lives that cannot be handled without moral knowledge, which allows us, do you remember, to act, to direct action, to formulate policy and supervise it, and to teach. And that's what we've lost. The moral life is not just a matter of some rules that we might think are to prevent us from having a good time. Often what are presented as moral rules don't make any sense. They have to be corrected by moral knowledge, not just thrown away. Morality is a matter of what we're living for, the kinds of persons we are becoming. Moral knowledge is basically knowledge of this. Morality is not just conformity. Again, it's often thought of that way, as conformity to what is proper, but is about building a life. Now, this is the part, I think, that we need most to pay attention to. Life has a nature. Interestingly, that is one of the points that is most commonly denied by recent thinkers, scholarship, even standard academic behavior. Human beings, you might think that a human being was a Brussels sprout or a squirrel from all you would hear. But human life has a nature. All life does. It has a structure. And moral distinctions are part of the reality which is human existence. Vice is a bitter reality, usually having to do with capitulation of the will and character to desire. This is the ancient moral battle that thinkers east and west from the beginning have understood. The problem is with desire and action from desire. How do you deal with it? Desire is not something that considers what is best. It considers what it wants. And it does what it wants without regard to what is best. And now if you will think about all of the garish cases that show up in our news and so on, you will realize that what is going on, the man that murdered the young girl down nearby has now been allowed to explain to us why he did it. If you listen to it, you will hear it was desire. Bill Clinton, when asked in an interview why he did what he did with Monica, said, I just could do it. Now, he lied. Either intentionally or not, he uttered a falsehood. He did it because of desire. Desire is what poses the problem for choice. And unless you have knowledge of good and evil and right and wrong to counteract desire and say, well, I know you want that, but there's this other. See, choice and deliberation, the function of will is to present alternatives. And one of the main lessons that you learn when you begin to study ethics and morality seriously is that your feelings and your desires are not your will. But many people in our culture today, because of the disappearance of moral knowledge, do not know that. They think their desires are their will. And that is the source of many of the deplorable situations that we face in our life. The virtues, temperance, courage, justice, wisdom, faith, hope, love, are reliable sources of direction, strength, joy, and peace. This is the content of traditional moral knowledge. That was the content of teaching in this country. And you go back and you look at the old readers for grammar schools and the way people were educated, and you see that all over the place. But now people look at it and what do they say? That's corny. Corn, by the way, is very nourishing. You can do a lot with it. The 7 deadly sins are deadly. There was a theological meaning to that in the 14th century, but that's not the only meaning. Pride, envy, all of the other things that are listed, lust, sloth, they'll kill you. They'll kill you. They'll ruin your mental health unless you have a way to deal with them. So now we have a series of difficulties. Last paragraph at last. Is it too much to think that our contemporary disasters, such as failure of covenants in family and business, in government, obesity, which is now posing a financial and health, addictions of all kinds, crime, financial chaos, failure of the educational system. How much, if the teachers, students, and administrators in our schools were pursuing a life of virtue, how much would that change in our schools? That all of these rest in some significant degree upon the failures of the lives and characters of some people involved. And that those failures rest, again, in some significant degree upon the disappearance of moral knowledge from our society in the sense explained. It would be a mistake, no doubt, to ascribe all of our problems to that disappearance. Not everything can be solved in this world by sincere effort, even if it's informed by knowledge. There are other problems, and we need to know about them and deal with them. But it seems to me that this disappearance has had and is having a very harmful effect on much of our life at present, and that is the responsibility of our institutions of knowledge to make moral knowledge available in the extent to which that is possible. Not by teaching rules, not by imposing condemnation or praise, but by the dispassionate analysis and communication of the nature of virtue and vice and character. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I want to thank you, Professor Willard, for a stunning lecture that I think I can speak for the rest of people here when I say it hit me right between the eyes.
Me too.
And it was a very challenging lecture. I want to open the question and answer period the way we're going to do it. If you have a question, if you could just come and line up here behind the microphone, and we'll have Professor Willard field as many of the questions as he can within our time frame. But I would like to open with the question of the problem of refounding moral knowledge after the trajectory that you've chronicled for us so well. You suggested a few people who have made attempts. Alistair McIntyre has attempted to refound moral knowledge by a recovery of virtue ethics, which it sounded like at the end of your lecture you were perhaps endorsing yourself, but you also suggested that his attempts have failed. So if he and others have failed, what do you think went wrong there with their attempts, and do you have another course of action to suggest to us?
Well, I'm glad to try that. That's a large order, but I wouldn't have shown up here if I didn't think I could respond to it. And you'll have to be the judge as to how well I respond to it. Let me take the part about an alternative basis. Frankly, John Rawls has to water down knowledge to the point that it's no longer knowledge, to claim a limited area of knowledge, and that's with reference to justice. So Rawls only deals with justice, and moreover, justice in social institutions. So he really has nothing to say about justice in persons. And you might think that if a person lived under just institutions, they would be just. But if you do think that, then you'll need to check the facts on it. Because just living in a just institution is not enough to make a just person, unfortunately. Justice is more demanding than that. So he doesn't actually have a full theory about, certainly not about virtue and vice, about character. And he's trying to dance with the devil of modern epistemologies that do not allow you to have knowledge of the self. So that's a very quick and dirty response to him. MacIntyre, I admire both of these people greatly. MacIntyre believes that virtue is an expression of community, and that people can know what is virtuous and vicious, and possibly, well, on his view, he's actually set up where if you know what it is by living in a community, then you will do it, which is a problem in itself. The problem for MacIntyre is, where do you get the community to start with? And there's a very plaintive end to his main book, which is called After Virtue. He's written others, some in criticism of Rawls, in which he says that the barbarians are already within the gate. It isn't like the Roman Empire, where you had them outside the gate and you had a chance to keep them out. They're already within. And he was frankly referring to the universities and associated institutions. And he says, we are now waiting not for Godot, but for another, and no doubt very different, Saint Benedict. And he's referring to the fact that it was fundamentally the Benedictine system of monasteries that managed eventually to pull the collapse of the Roman Empire into a new era of living together in Europe. Now, that's the problem. Where do you get the community? Where do you get if virtue is simply an expression of a communal order, where are you going to get the community to produce the virtue? Now, actually, MacIntyre himself has become a very devout Roman Catholic Christian since he wrote that book. Maybe St. Benedict got to him. But I don't think that you can handle this in terms of building a community and then getting to virtue, because you're going to have the virtue to build the community. And that's going to have to be individuals who do that. And obviously there's going to have to be some social and communal conditions. And we eventually have to deal with where we're going to get that. And people, like most of us here, I think, myself, we have to look candidly at the university and ask, is that the community? And I think the answer, unfortunately, is it is not. And that's a long discussion, but basically the conditions in which people live in university communities today have almost no moral content at all. though we're all trying desperately to be nice, or at least to be thought nice. Now, finally, to what I perceive to be the third part of your question, where do you begin? Well, two things to be said about that. One is you begin by looking at the wisdom that is in whatever tradition you have. And, of course, there is a very strong moral tradition in Europe and in America, and we need to look back at that and see what it says, and take the corny parts and test them in life, and then to begin to teach. What actually is wrong in a priest molesting a child sexually? See, we don't talk about that. What's wrong with lying to someone? All of the other things that everyone, yes, they're wrong. What's wrong? That's where we need to write and teach and think. And then, of course, if you have a tradition to work from, use it. If you are a Christian, which in this country is most likely to be the tradition, well, use it. Put it to the test. What do you think your tradition teaches about morality? Understand it. If you think, for example, that your tradition says that you ought to love your neighbor as yourself, that's the place to begin. If you think the content of ethical teaching is love, okay, let's make sense of it. Let's don't just say the word. How do you put it into practice? How do you put it into practice if you're a university professor or a student? See, that's, you go back and you look. Now, in my case, I spend a lot of time reading all of these thinkers, Christian and not, about what's to be done. And you compare them. And you ask yourself, what is the kind of life that is best? Now, it may be that there are some that are fairly comparable. But you face that issue, and you answer it, and you live by the answer. And for those of us who are members of the chattering class, as Marx used to call them, that means we talk and write about it. Now, the other institution, speaking broadly, that has to deal with this are the religious institutions. And I'll just say church, but understand I mean all forms that have places where they meet and communities which they want to develop. So if you're Muslim or Jewish or Christian or whatever, build the character that would be suggested as ideal in that tradition. You say, well, which one is right? Let life decide it, as well as thought. And meet the challenge. See, one of the things that has happened, I briefly sketched how religion and theology were moved out of the domain of knowledge. Now our religious institutions are apt to say they're just teaching tradition. Tradition is not knowledge. It could be, in some cases, if it is truthful to the life that it touches. Could be knowledge. But knowledge is not something that happens to you externally. You have to rise up and seize it. That's why seeking is such an important part of the religious life. Seeking, if you, too many times we think of religion as, well, we've got it all right and settled, now we're just waiting for something to happen. Right. The life of the Christian, I'll speak of that because that's where I'm coming from, is one of seeking. one of the primary teachings is seek first the kingdom of God. What does that mean? And its kind of righteousness. Okay, now, secular humanism, it has a proposal to make. You put those down by one another, or whatever is being proposed, and you use your mind, and you learn the practice, and you put it to the test of life. That's how virtues are developed. Now, the Greeks had the idea that you would set up your government properly and then everyone would be virtuous. Not likely. Didn't work for them. There's a wonderful phrase by T.S. Eliot, we're all looking for a system so perfect that we won't have to be good. And that's painfully true. Okay, that's not an adequate answer, but that's the best I can do, I think. Yes?
Well, he actually took the original question with McIntyre. I was curious what you had to say about him, too. But you said that the problem with McIntyre's account is that where do you get the community? What about, like, Christian supplemental accounts where they take McIntyre's basis in virtue ethics and they say, well, we actually already have an existing community that's been in existence for a couple thousand years, and then they just use that account and take its basis there. How would that work?
I think that's St. Benedict, right? See, McIntyre seems not to have known that St. Benedict didn't create communities. He brought one and inducted people into it. See, that's a different story. I'm sure St. Benedict, if he's read that page, is astonished that anyone could say what he said. See, you have the community that he presupposed is what is called the kingdom of God.
Follow up really quick. How would that community then speak out and contribute to the moral knowledge of the broader community if they're already coming from that position?
There's a lot of talk about the public square and so on, but we're all in the public square all the time. And if you're forming a Muslim community or a Christian community or whatever, you are in the public square. The people who are there live in the world. And so you teach and think at the very best level for the people that are there, and then they are members of the larger community, and they share that as we might share any body of knowledge that we have. It has to be approached in that way, and not just as, well, I don't have knowledge, I just have beliefs, and I'm trying to get you to have those beliefs too. See, that's a different approach, and that's the one, unfortunately, that most people are tied to. It's not sharing knowledge. The people share knowledge in a totally different way. If you think you have knowledge of the virtuous life and of the vicious life, you will share it in a very different way than trying to get people to do things. Yes, sir.
Yes, Dr. Willard, I was wondering, you mentioned Freud earlier.
Yes.
And if I got Freud right in part, he said moral knowledge could be understood through the unconscious, located there, in fact, and understood.
He puts it in the superego.
Yeah, okay. And then others also, such as Ayn Rand, well-known novelist, has suggested that reason and rational self-interest can also give us moral knowledge. And in fact, it opens up more tolerance and diversity within the society. So there's two major thinkers. And I'm wondering, you're suggesting that moral knowledge then is best coming from theology and religious institutions.
No, I'm not suggesting that.
Okay.
I'm challenging theology and religious institutions to do what they can.
What they can do. But in challenge there is not the religious institutions in part. It leads to, and oftentimes, especially Christian faith, exclusive claims, which then, at sometimes we talked about the problems with tolerance and even the barbarians coming out and seen in religious wars. So any comments?
I'm not sure. Let me see if I've got you, okay? You're talking about an attitude of exclusiveness that essentially writes off other approaches.
Well, can exclusive, even the claim of exclusivity and knowledge, lead to intolerance?
Yeah. Okay, I think I got it. This is really important because, for example, all truth is exclusive. If it's true that your shirt is red, that excludes your shirt being blue, logically. Now, an attitude of exclusiveness is another thing. That's where you can draw an important distinction. Does the fact that I know that truthfulness and honesty are among the essential properties of a good and healthy life? I claim to know that, by the way. You may want to challenge that. Does that mean that I don't have anything to do with people who disagree with me, or even with people who are dishonest? Not necessarily. That's a choice. So exclusiveness in the sense in which one truth excludes other truths is a logical matter. And there's nothing you can do about that. Actually, you do have people today who will suggest that if you just would, you could believe that all religions are equal and all moralities are equal and all cultures are equal. Well, you can say that, but you can't do it. And to be nice, you might say it. But you can't believe things that contradict one another. You can't do it. So exclusiveness as a logical principle is one thing. Exclusiveness as a human attitude is another thing. And I don't encourage the second one. But you're going to have a basis in virtue to do that.
Thank you.
I guess I'm a little uncomfortable with the phrase moral knowledge, and I'm thinking that it might be safer to be talking about ethical principles, because it seems that the evidence is clear that people that are good and honest and reasonable can actually disagree about what the right thing to do is, whether the right thing to do is having to do with abortion,
Right?
or healthcare reform.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I'm wondering, how would you go about differentiating these different claims to knowledge
Mm-hmm.
of these different positions?
Mm-hmm.
And also, how would you safeguard against what would be, and this is related to the earlier question that the other gentleman asked, the dangerous absolutizing of knowledge, because if individuals are actually convinced that they have knowledge of the truth, it seems very easy for them to slide into a kind of, whether it would be imperialism against other cultures or arrogance
Mm-hmm.
towards individuals. And how would you safeguard against that?
By teaching the virtue of love and respect. Not by saying, well, we just drop knowledge because there's disagreement. See, disagreement is compatible with knowledge. People of goodwill can disagree over things. The man who discovered that doctors who went from one person, perhaps a dead body, to examine a woman about to give birth to a child, the doctor who discovered that was opposed and fired from several jobs in Vienna. He was right. The others were wrong. Now, agreement does not secure knowledge, and knowledge is compatible with disagreement. The question how you're going to handle the attitudes of tolerance, arrogance, and so on is in fact a moral question that depends upon moral truth. Now that may take a while to, Now your question also raises the other issue that in our culture, the senses of morality and ethics have changed so that you can have ethical principles and you can disagree about those. As long as you don't act on them, it doesn't make any difference. When you act on them, that's where morality comes into play. Now, once again, I think it is so important to understand that this particular problem, which is an incredible social problem and personal problem in many cases, cannot be dealt with by simply saying we don't have moral knowledge. In fact, I believe you can only deal with it if you say we do have moral knowledge. And the people who decide that those who become absolutized and arrogant about their claims, well, they don't hold these up as morally admirable people. They think that there's actually something wrong with that. And they are right. But if you're going to be tolerant, you have to have a really strong basis in your character to do that. And so often today, we just talk about tolerance, but what does it mean? Here's your question. Can you tolerate someone without loving them? And if so, how much is gained? See, we have built in our culture in recent decades around very important issues the idea of giving people rights without loving them. Now, sometimes the situation is so bad that we need to do that. And we've seen a great deal of it, and that's good. But in fact, our country is sick with anger between groups of people where there have been conceded rights and tolerance at that level, but they don't care about them. What good have we done? Limited, yes. But justice never does justice to justice. You have to have more. So, see, I think that line of questioning, which is very important, we need to ask it and pursue it, precisely points us toward moral knowledge, not away from it. Yes, sir.
Going back to page 1 of your handout, you point out in point F the growth of the idea that it is always wrong to make moral judgments, that only bad or disgusting people do that.
Right.
And I was wondering if you might comment a little bit further on the fact that stating that such things are wrong in themselves are moral judgments, are they not? And I was wondering if there's a line to be drawn of where they become wrong or not in today's thinking. For instance, somebody breaks into my home, I can say, that's illegal. Nobody would get upset at me. Somebody breaks into my country, I say, that's illegal. I'm a bigot. So I'm just curious how...
Thank you. I'm going to fall off now and break my neck. No, look, I mean, there's a difference between politics and morals. What you're dealing with in the latter case is a lot of political issues, involve deeply many persons that have been hurt one way or another around it. And so when you say that, then a different set of attitudes comes at you. It's not particularly moral. It's based on political considerations that have evolved into moral attitudes. You cross the line to the moral when you are now referring to a person in a way that indicates they are not acceptable as a person.
But the statement that I made wasn't about the person, it was about their actions.
Well,
the person who breaks into my house, I would
yeah.
say those actions are illegal. The person who breaks into my country, I would say those actions are illegal. I'm not making a statement about...
I thought you were talking about what people say to you when you say the latter.
Right, well, yeah, that's true.
They say, you're a bad person.
Right.
Right. You are not to be accepted. You're not to be emulated. You don't say to your child, now be like that person. See, that's where the moral comes in. Moral comes in when you begin to make judgments related to the acceptability or unacceptability of a person. And of course, we are just loaded with that now in this country. And a part of the difficulty there is because there's no moral knowledge to have recourse to.
Thank you.
Professor, does the Darwinian evolutionary paradigm contribute in any way to the disappearance of moral knowledge?
It depends on the particular person you're talking to. For example, Darwin himself did not think that moral knowledge disappeared. He treated the moral sense as a part of the biological character of the human species. So it doesn't disappear. You have to add on some other things. Now, some people would say if he were consistent, it would have disappeared. But, I mean, who's consistent? Right? I mean, no, I mean, his own attitudes towards morality and religion were probably at considerable odds with a strict interpretation of his biological theory.
So is morality tied to personal accountability?
That certainly is tied to that, yes.
And so if you remove the creator-creature relationship, you remove all accountability.
I don't agree with that. I think we're accountable to one another as well. Now, you may need to add something more, especially if you're concerned about how to become the kind of person who actually lives according to moral principles. But just like there's a famous statement that's often quoted from Dostoevsky, from Ivan, where he says, if there's no God, everything is permitted. No, no. If everything else remains as it is, then moral distinctions and other distinctions will be the same. Now, that's a big if. But if that's true, I mean, if human life remained exactly as it is, but there were no God. Now, I'm not talking about the possibility of that. Just say, if that's true, there would still be accountability.
Correct.
Tiger Woods would still be accountable to his wife.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi. On the first page you say, knowledge is the capacity to represent something as it is on an appropriate basis of thought and experience. What is a moral truth other than what we represent it to be?
Well, we could represent a moral falsehood. That is done. In the case of moral truth, because of what truth is, that is a representation of something as it is. For example, if dishonesty is not a morally admirable character, if it's not that, then anyone who thought it was would be mistaken. Right? So the problem is to get moral truth, or any kind of truth, if you have truth, then you have a representation of something as it is. Now, you can have truth with still and not know it. Right? If you bet on whatever horse that was that won the Kentucky Derby, your bet was true, but you didn't know it, or if you did know it, the police will want to talk to you. Right? So, truth brings the object with it. But you can have moral falsehood as well as moral truth. And in that case, what is represented is not as it is represented. Tricky stuff. Now, you have to go sit down and write out a piece of paper what you think truth is, what you think knowledge is, and so on, and then you can begin to work on it. I'm not trying to jam what I said down your throats. I'm trying to articulate something, and hopefully you can work on it.
Thank you.
I think we'll take just one more question, if that's all right.
Okay.
Hi, this might be a little bit more of a pragmatic question, but I'm currently pursuing a position as a social science teacher in high
Yes.
school, public high schools. And I was just wondering, how do you envision moral knowledge and practice in our public schools? While I myself, as a teacher, am currently barred from formally promoting theology as knowledge. I mean, would you suggest the teaching of the virtues, rewrite of the curriculum? What would you suggest?
Do a sociology of virtue and vice.
Okay.
You don't need to go to theology to do that. Just honestly teach about the role of virtue and vice, and by that I mean things like simple things, like lying, stealing, not keeping your promises, covetousness and envy. You see, that's the thing that social scientists will not touch. See, I mean, just stick to the facts
Yeah, I agree.
and help your students understand that. Because your students, by and large, have been given the impression, especially if they might be religious, they've been given the impression that wrongdoing is actually a good thing. It's just God has a thing about it. You know? and that really, now see, that's because they've never looked at it.
True.
And this is what I encourage as many people as I can and try to practice myself, is helping people look at virtue and vice. And then on the basis of that, helping them look at character and understand that they are forming their character and that it is going to have incredible consequences for their life.
Yeah.
I see, you can do that. You don't have to preach. You don't have to exhort. You don't have to start complaining to people and grinding them down. Just help them understand it. There's a wonderful article by Bob Coles that appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education some years ago, in which a young lady comes to him. He teaches at Harvard. A young lady came to him, and she was on some scholarship, but she had to work cleaning rooms in order to pay her way. And her fellow students treated her badly because she had to work. And one of them, she cleaned rooms, and one of them routinely propositioned her for sex. And he was a person that had been in classes with her on moral thought, right? And he made A's. And so finally this young woman just says, I'm out of here, and she goes to Bob Coles just to tell him what she thinks. And Bob is a good man, and I don't know if you know that name, but he's a wonderful, wonderful man. But he couldn't say anything. And it's a lovely little statement of the quandary of someone like him. And he later tried to make some adjustments, but the truth of the matter, he never discussed with that young man what is wrong with propositioning your classmate who has to work her way through college, university. He never explained. You see, we don't talk about that kind of thing. We just say, don't do it.
Yeah.
If we say that. And we've been through a period where we wouldn't even say that. See, we are failing in our intellectual responsibility in this area. And we don't have to do that. And you won't have to do that. Though you will meet some people now who will say, if you talk about that, that's religious. It's very interesting how this is developing in our language, that any kind of morality is being gradually associated with religion so that it can be dismissed as not appropriate to discuss in a school situation. And some people will tell you it violates church and state. So morality violates church and state. And now some programs that are out on sexual harassment actually present it in such a way that an atheist can't have ethics because ethics is religion. See, when you depart from real serious quest for knowledge, things go crazy. And then the language starts to show up. But it will be regarded as so important that you will regard the absurdity that is being plainly said because there's a good reason. But you can do it. You can do it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.